our life started to change. We're here. We're hungry. We have lost everything. As father and son, we have walked together. We have fallen together. We have skinned our knees together. Nicaragua, Honduras, Tampa, Ybor City, but now this is survival. We're hungry.
Welcome back, lads, to another Stogie Lads podcast. Today we're doing something special and a bit different from what you guys have heard from us before, because today we're going to go in depth on a very famous cigar brand called Arturo Fuente, which I'm sure many of you have heard. We wanted to do this to celebrate cigar history and just really go into depth into brand that we know so well today but might not know the history of. And we thought that Arturo Fuente was a great way to start this off. So we're very excited to go through the history with you guys here and all of the things that this wonderful company has gone through.
Yeah, very well said, Lod. Very well said. So our story, much like many cigar-related stories, begins in Cuba. In 1887, a boy named Arturo Fuente was born in the small town of Guines, south of Havana. As a result of the Spanish-American War and all the turmoil it created in Cuba, many of the Fuente family, including some of his siblings, had left Cuba for Key West in 1904. Arturo would join them 2 years later in 1906 to seek a better life in the United States, like many Cubans before him have and countless of Cubans after him continue to do. After a few years in Key West, Arturo Fuente has finally grown up to become a young adult, and he's now filled with aspiration and hope. It's now that in 1910, Arturo Fuente moves from Key West to West Tampa to chase his dreams. He had always had a dream of creating a cigar company, and he did that just 2 years later in 1912. He'd now managed to scrape together enough resources to launch the A. Fuente & Company, cigar manufacturing company in West Tampa. The original factory used by the company was a classic 3-story wooden building, which was one of the nearly 200 cigar-making facilities in the city of Tampa alone at the time, where hundreds of million cigars were made each year. So he's really come to a melting pot of cigar manufacturing here in Florida. All of these manufacturers in West Tampa would import tobacco from nearby Cuba for production into finished cigars. So they're just importing tobacco and they're rolling the cigars there in Florida. He also wanted to make cigars using the Cuban tobacco he was used to from his homeland. And clearly here already, this is a very different time, long before the U.S. embargo on Cuba. So using Cuban tobacco in the United States was actually very much commonplace, as you've noticed that all the manufacturers there in Tampa was using Cuban tobacco. So his company and their handmade Cuban cigars grew slowly but steadily and had done well enough for him to have employed an impressive 500 people in just 10 years. And you know, as a like 20-something-year-old guy starting at a company and growing it enough to 500 people in 10 years, I think that's pretty impressive. I'm not sure how the statistics at the time were, but definitely he's done very well just as a young immigrant kid starting from nothing. It's pretty impressive. But you know, sure, it's not the Arturo Fuente we know today. But from a simple Cuban immigrant, like I said, to a very sustainable company, he'd done very well for himself. All this was about to change, however, as a massive tragedy struck in 1924. In the same year that it had grown to become big enough to be now a legal corporation, Arturo Fuente would experience a low unlike any he'd ever felt before. So in late 1924, like I mentioned, Arturo was on one of his regular trips down to his native Cuba. He was there, as always, just seeking out suitable cigar tobacco to import for his company that they would then, of course, roll into cigars in Florida. But it's at the time where he's actually away in Cuba that his simple wooden factory catches on fire and completely burns down to the ground. And, at the time where the fire safety was pretty lax and buildings like A. Fuente and Company's factory were predominantly made out of wood, this was all too common. And again, I'm not sure really what the standards were like, but I was just thinking, we see factories today where the rollers and the inspectors and the blenders and everyone, they're just smoking cigars all the time. And I'm sure the case was the same back then, when people consumed much more tobacco than they do today. And I'm just thinking, like, they're all just wooden buildings. It's almost a miracle that it didn't happen earlier. But the tragedy did strike in 24, and yeah, like I said, his wooden factory burnt down. And even though his company had been growing, it was far from prepared for a major issue like this. Young Arturo and his company were tragically underinsured, and this meant that he barely got anything back from the fire whatsoever from his insurance, and the factory was also so badly burnt to the ground that he would have needed to build an entirely new one. There was nothing really to save. And of course, as a young entrepreneur businessman, he got nothing from insurance. He also lacked the funds himself to build a new factory. So you can ask yourself what happened. And as this is a real story, there's no real room here for a fairy tale savior, sadly, for young Arturo Fuente. So A. Fuente and Company and all its cigar production just simply ceased to exist. The company had no means to continue, so it simply stopped existing. Nothing else to move on with. On top of all this, Arturo Fuente actually went through a divorce with his wife at the time as well, Doña Hilda. So Arturo, so distraught and impoverished from all the events that had just happened in such a short amount of time as well, he moved all the way far away from the Florida and the tropical climate that he was used to, all the way up to Chicago to escape and find work. And I'm sure there was a bit of the economic part here where he wanted to get some jobs there in like a big growing industrial city, but I'm sure there was also a mix of that, trying to escape the tragedy that he'd left behind in Florida and everything he'd known. So he moves all the way to Chicago, other side of the country. But when that didn't work out, he, with the tail between his legs, he had to return to Florida. And this time he elected not to go back to West Tampa. And again, I'm sure the fire tragedy still haunted him there. It's tough to go back to the same place where you just, quote unquote, failed and had so much negativity happen to you. So he chose to go to another town, very close by though still, called Ybor City. And here, Arturo wasn't the only immigrant coming from Cuba, as we've highlighted, to the United States to establish a life for himself there. But here, a Spaniard named Vicente Martinez Ybor laid the groundwork for Arturo in a way. Isn't that right, lad?
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm sure some of you might have heard of Ybor City, since we all are very into cigars here. But if you haven't, just let me rewind the tape a bit so I can really go into what happened in this area around Tampa before it became the prosperous cigar city that it was and still is today. So it's actually kind of a funny story here involving pure chance, friendship, and guava trees, funnily enough. So in the year 1884, a Spanish emigre by the name Gabino Gutierrez was employed by a New York City fruit packaging company. So nothing about cigars here. And he had heard that there were many guava trees growing in just that Tampa Bay area. So with ambition, he set out to investigate this rumor, but faced many difficulties on the way there. One of them being that, the railroad system only went as far south as Jacksonville. And I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with Florida, but that's about 200 miles or 300 kilometers short of Tampa Bay. So there weren't any railroads, which meant that he had to travel by stagecoach through unpaved roads, really just nothing that was, very easy to get through. And the second problem was that the rumor that he set out for with this journey didn't turn out to be very true, since he didn't even find any guava trees there that could be extracted for commercial production. So remember, at this time, Tampa was an isolated village with a population of less than 1,000 people. It's very strange to think that today, that, Tampa being this big city now. At that time, less than 1,000 people lived there. But there were prospects of growing into a bigger economy there due to the expansion of the South Florida Railway that would connect Tampa to the rest of the country. So Gutierrez, he left Tampa with slight sour taste of not finding the guava trees he set out for, but still with hope that the area would have potential for development once the connecting railroad would be in place. But before returning to New York City, he made a stop in Key West because one of his friends, Vicente Martinez Ibor, like you mentioned earlier, lad, he was living at Key West in that time. Ibor was not a guava merchant, but instead he had built a prosperous cigar making operation in Havana, but escaped from Cuba in 1868 to avoid arrest or even death from the Spanish colonial rule there, because he was involved both financially and expressed his support to the Cuban revolutionaries there that were fighting against the Spanish colonial rule. So what he did was he resumed his business in Key West after leaving Cuba, but wasn't completely happy with the rising costs there, the labor disputes, and obviously the transportation issues that arose there in the early 1880s. So he was looking for other options actually to relocate during the time that Gutierrez made this visit to him after his failed financial trip to Tampa. So what Gutierrez did was that he actually mentioned Tampa as a possible replacement because he did see the potential there. So very quickly, Ibor made his way to Tampa together with another cigar manufacturer, Ignacio Haya. And what they realized was that Tampa was actually the perfect location to set up cigar production. It was near enough to Cuba to import tobacco by sea. It was a warm and humid climate that would keep tobacco leaves fresh and workable, and of course the newly expanding railroad that would allow for transportation of the produced cigars to the entire United States. So Ibor brought several other cigar manufacturers with him, and by 1885 Ybor City was founded as an independent town and quickly became home to cigar manufacturing in the US, which was later annexed by Tampa, which awarded Tampa the nickname Cigar City, which it still has today. So it is there in Ybor City, this flourishing agricultural town created by an immigrant and filled with many more immigrants searching for a better life, that Arturo settles again, our main character at this point. He still had the passion and dream of continuing a cigar company, obviously since it went down in such a bad way for him. But we've now reached the Great Depression in the 1930s. And like I said, for a man who lost his whole company to that fire just a few years ago, there wasn't much to build on during this poor economic area. So Arturo had to toil away as a general manager and save up resources for what turned out to be over 2 decades. So it is now that in 1946, well after the Great Depression, and now even with World War II behind him, that Arturo Fuente, much like much of the world at the time, was filled with hope and aspiration. So he had finally decided that it was the right time to re-enter the cigar industry, all these years after that first fire. Still scarred by his past venture, however, he decided to be much more careful this time.
Yeah, so first I just want to touch on quickly the fact that I realize for a listener it might be a little bit quick moving here in the beginning. We have jumped from the 1910s when he moved to the US to the 20s when he started his business, just mentioning the 30s, and then quickly to 1946 where we are now. But a lot of the reason behind this, I mean, Arturo didn't keep his personal diary. I guess that wasn't that commonplace at the time. And in the 1930s, the Great Depression, there's not that much going on in the world, and he's not really living his dream at this point. So, he's not really documenting his life during this time. I mean, he's just really working, trying to scrape together all the resources he can get to actually make his dream come true. So it's actually decades, and that's what's kind of crazy about this, that it's been over 2 decades now since the fire, where we reached this 1946 time after, like Ruben said, the Great Depression and World War II. And again, like you mentioned, he wanted to be much more careful this time, and this immediately shows itself, because instead of going big and investing in a real factory like he did the first time, the new Arturo Fuente cigar factory, as it was now called, was just his back porch, actually, of his own house in Ybor City. And this was just a 10 by 16 foot porch, and it only had a few simple rolling stations making cigars there in the outdoor area. Again, their cigars would use tobacco brought from his native Cuba. So even though we're jumping ahead a lot in the time, we're still far away from the embargo. We're still very much in the era where clear Havanas, that they're called at the time, are the popular cigar. Cuban tobacco imported to the United States is still very much the norm. So Arturo himself, along with his wife Cristina, and now he's found a new wife, rolled cigars all day long, and they actually were able to hire a few more workers. But this work wasn't hard enough, though. As the cigar rolling continued far into the night, way after these hired rollers would go home, Arturo's wife, again Cristina, was very instrumental into the production of this time, and she would make huge Cuban pots of food, Cuban pots of that famous Cuban coffee, and she would serve it to all the various friends and family members. And they would come over late at night after their own full-time jobs ended, just to help Arturo and his wife roll a few cigars in the evening. And this was kind of a loud and family gathering style event that would happen every night. Pretty much people would come over, have some food, roll cigars, and everyone was just helping each other out. It was all very much a family core of a business. And Arturo himself here, I mean, he'd finally gotten his opportunity, right? He's finally back on the horse. He can finally have his own company again. So he was really crazed in this time. He's described as he would smoke around 25 cigars a day, which I find incredible. I don't even know how you get through that many a day. But yeah, he would often fall asleep with one in his mouth. He would smoke until he fell asleep, basically. And the classic thing that would happen then is that cigar would fall out of his mouth, of course, and then his wife would have to go pick that up and put it on his bedside table. And why she didn't throw it away? Well, that's because every morning when he woke up the next day, he'd put that same cigar in his mouth, and the new day would begin. He'd be ready to go. And again, this just kind of brings me back to the whole fire hazard thing, right? Because I don't understand how you after one of your factory has burnt down, you just smoke cigars, lit cigars, or just rolling out of your mouth on the floor every night. That's kind of crazy. But
yeah, you're like, his dream had been vanished from that fire as well, and it's been so many years after, and then without much
really playing with fate here. But at this time, when we're here into the late 40s, a new generation of Fuentes had entered the picture. When the back porch production began, Carlos Fuente was 11 years old already. So although it wasn't his moniker at the time, I just want to quickly mention that we'll refer to him as Carlos Fuente Sr. from now on to avoid confusion. Very quick sidebar, the Fuentes love naming their kids after themselves. So there's a lot of Carlos Fuentes. There are several Arturo Fuentes. So this Carlos, Arturo Fuentes' son, will be Carlos Sr. from now on. But he also had a brother, and along with his brother Arturo Jr., they would both, much like the rest of the family, help out the business all the time. As young kids, obviously they do more chore-like tasks like sweeping the floor and helping out with menial stuff like that, but they'd soon be taught the mechanics as well of how to roll a cigar, and soon they'd be making cigars themselves and had to make at least 50 each day. That's what they call the homework. 50 each day after coming home from school as youngsters. And clearly, this is a very, very different time. But going back now, after touching on Carlos Sr. and Arturo Jr., how is life for our main character still in this story, Arturo Fuente himself, Lon?
Yes, so to continue with Arturo, he obviously had to continue to work hard, even through his age now. We've swept through so many decades, he's actually racking up some ages on his neck. And as he entered his 60s now, he was still working relentlessly with the cigars. And Carlos Sr. increasingly pitched in to help because, he was watching his father do this work when he was growing up. And he didn't want to see his aging father slave away, really, as the way he was doing. And obviously the Fuentes were hard workers from the get-go. And Carlos Sr. definitely showed this ambition and work ethic. as he was taught from his father Arturo himself. So both the fighting spirit and the work ethic continued all throughout the 1950s. As this second iteration of the Arturo Fuente Cigar Company was much, much smaller, it did not take off in the same way. Remember, they were rolling these cigars in their own home, really. So it was, there was no really upscaled business for this. The growth was quite stagnant due to this. So Carlos Sr. had to keep working other jobs on the side, to support his family and the family business at that. So besides rolling cigars and helping his father, he worked part-time in a bakery, while his wife worked part-time for another cigar factory, actually, on the side. So the company didn't expand much and stayed pretty much local, only selling cigars to people in the Tampa and Ybor City region. Also only by cash, really. So Arturo Fuente was growing old now, and in the late 1950s, we reach a crucial moment in the company's history. As has been highlighted, Arturo Fuente, the company, has been very much a family business, having every aspect of the family involved. So Arturo Fuente wanted this to continue, and his goal was to hand this company over to the next generation. His intention, as was often customary, was originally to hand that generation forward to his firstborn son, Arturo Jr. But as you might have noticed, we haven't at all really brought him up and barely touched on him because we're more focused on Carlos Sr. Let us highlight his life and relationships a little more so we can understand why.
Yeah, definitely. Carlos Sr. was really, as has become quite clear, he's the one who has the passion for the business. He's the one that has the passion for the cigars. Arturo Jr. was a little more lax with this stuff. He was a little bit more aloof. There's actually a funny story that Carlos Sr. told, just to go off on a tiny tangent, where, as we mentioned, they had to come home and roll cigars, 50 each, for homework. And the goal was for them to roll 50 each. But Arturo Jr., he wasn't a huge fan of this. He didn't love rolling. He wanted to go and play or, hang out with friends or whatever. So he wanted to kind of cheat and work together with Carlos Sr. and kind of, roll the cigars together in some way. I'm not sure exactly how the mechanics would have worked, but Carlos Sr. tells the story in the way that Arturo wanted to kind of cheat his way out of it, and Carlos didn't want to. He didn't want to rush the time of hands, and this is a theme that we'll definitely see with the Arturo Fuente company in the future. But basically, Arturo is much more distant, and he's not as passionate about this. But Carlos Sr. had been working to support the family since he was 8. Like many people had to do at this time. This is, 70 plus years ago, 80 plus years ago. He'd sold fruits in the streets. He did classic street jobs, like shoe shining, like kids used to do back in those days. So rolling cigars at home for him, that was certainly an upgrade in his mind. And Carlos Sr. even continued to do odd jobs on the side, like we mentioned, to support the company well into his teenage years. He worked at pharmacies late into the night. He delivered newspapers. But this fighting spirit that we've sort of started touching on a little bit here, it showed in other ways as well. And this is where another sort of tragedy in the family happens. Carlos Sr. actually contracts polio at the age of 12. Again, we just kind of see here how long ago this is, because this is at the time where FDR had polio, right? And a lot of people are getting paralyzed, and this is kind of a normal disease. And he couldn't walk normally for years. But he was inspired by his father to keep fighting. He had to be quarantined for months right after he contracted the disease. And his father, Arturo Fuente, would come to the hospital every day. They couldn't see each other. They just had to see each other through the window. And his father would just say, "Don't give up, don't give up," and just kept pushing him basically to keep going. And that's, I guess, not really how diseases work, but either by miracle or this fighting spirit, that's the way the Fuentes kind of push the narrative here, is that he was able to regain his ability to walk. And that's actually not very common. Most people were paralyzed and faced tougher fates than Carlos Sr. So he was able to regain his ability to walk. That chapter was sort of behind him, and he was able to move on from there. A little bit later in his life, another tidbit here in his life, he saw a woman waiting for a red light. Kind of a funny story, and he became so obsessed with her and her beauty immediately, and describes it as he fell in love at first sight. Then he saw her again at a baseball game, and again was so perplexed with her beauty that he couldn't focus on the game at all, didn't keep track of the score, all that stuff. And again, this sort of fighting spirit, he just knew he this was the woman for him. So when he finally got the opportunity to talk to her, this was in the hallways of his high school. There he was able to, ask her out on a date, all this stuff, and their relationship finally blossomed. And this woman, of course, was Ana Lopez, who ended up becoming Carlos Sr.'s wife. They married at 18. And this is another woman, much like we touched on Cristina, Arturo Fuente's wife, a little bit, helping out. Ana Lopez turns out to be very instrumental as well, both to the family, both to Carlos Sr. himself, but to the company as a whole. Ruben mentioned slightly that she also worked on the side at a very prestigious Cuesta Rey factory. Actually, that's a brand that still is available today. So she rolled cigars there to support the business, and obviously carried that over. Carlos Sr. and his wife's complete devotion to helping the family and the company helped tip the scales when we return here in 1958 to Arturo Fuente's big decision. Arturo at this point was 68 years old, which doesn't add up mathematically. I realize the Fuentes are actually pretty bad at keeping the numbers straight, because if he's 68 at this point, he should have been born in 1890, but they claim he's born in 1887. In one other interview, Carlos Sr. says Arturo was 65 to 68 at this point, so we're not really sure. Yeah. Let's just say 68 because that's what they wrote down. But at 68, however, he could finally retire. He could finally collect Social Security. But basically, the reason he had to pass it down at this age is, in the States at the time, if you want to collect Social Security, you couldn't have a job and an active income. So basically, he had to pass the company down. And like we said, instead of passing the company down to his firstborn, Arturo Jr., the son that was named after him, he passed it down to Carlos Sr. Arturo Jr. actually had a well-paying job in the peanut industry at the time, so he was not interested whatsoever. Because Carlos Sr. showed much more passion and commitment, like we said, he was the one who got the company. Arturo saw that unquenchable thirst to grow the company within Carlos Sr., and he recognized that within himself as well, and he really saw that this was the person to keep the torch going, carry the torch. And Carlos Sr.'s responsibilities had actually increased so much already that he was already seen as the head of the company, really, by a lot of the the family and the employees. So it wasn't that radical of a decision in the end. So in 1958, Carlos Sr. purchased the company, quote unquote, for $1. They had to do it this way to make it a legal transfer, again, so Arturo Fuente could get his Social Security, and then so thereby he gained the assets of the company, and the company was worth about $1,100, so well over $1,000, and zero debt. So there was a lot of potential for the company to grow, but obviously it's not huge at the time, and it's been 12 years already since they launched the company. So again, like Ruben said, they're not really expanding too much. It's still being made in the house for 12 years, and the assets aren't huge. There's no debt because they just did the cash sales, but at the time of the transaction, he did leave his father a promising sentence where he promised his father that as long as you live, when I make $1, you will also make $1. So that's what he kind of wanted to leave his father with. But yeah, lad, keep it going here with Carlos, because we're far from done.
We're far from done, because the first baton passing has been made now to Carlos Sr., who was, although we call him Carlos Sr. at this point, he is very much a young man. But he never went to college, since he had to work part-time at the bakery and help with the company at home. So he didn't go to college, but he never actually even graduated from high school. But there was this firing ambition in him, which guided him, and he decided to take some risks to expand the company, not like his father Arturo, who wanted to take things very much on a smaller scale and take a secure path. Carlos wanted to bring some risk into this. So what he did was he began by opening a lot more accounts in Florida to grow the company's reach and sales, which meant that he also decided to change the method of sales. So like I mentioned, instead of a classic cash for cigars type of sales strategy like his father had, he decided to sell cigars on credit. So this was completely new at the time and seen as a massive risk, really, especially considering Carlos Sr. had zero academic background and no sales experience whatsoever. So it also different, yeah, like I said, from his father's philosophy, who wanted to sell the cigars for cash. Obviously, Arturo was much more old-fashioned in that sense, and he only really believed in cash-in-hand type payments. Obviously, from his background where it was very much insecurity, and he wanted some security for his family. But still, Carlos Sr., he prevailed, and all his risks paid off in a major way. The next 10 years were monumental for the company, as they were able to set up distributors in Miami and even in Manhattan. Yeah, so what Carlos Sr.'s focus really was on markets with a large Hispanic community, as they had been the ones who had traditionally been the big cigar consumers in the United States. And although they did experience growth, it was not as much as Carlos Sr. had hoped for. They were able to employ a few more workers, but the factory was still in Arturo Fuente's house, remember? And Carlos Sr. still lived there with his wife. Times were simple at this time, so you could actually run a cigar business from your house that worked, but there obviously was some cap to this.
Mm-hmm.
And the new workers that they brought in obviously needed room in the house, and now the back porch wasn't the only place where they'd actually roll the cigars. They vacated all the rooms inside the house now and put the furniture actually outside to get the necessary space needed. So finally, they felt this level of production was not sustainable in the house, since they were getting more and more clients. And in the early 1960s, Carlos Sr. purchased a 2-floor building in Ybor City on the corner of 17th and 18th Avenue. So this is actually a very big moment in their history, because this is the first time they've really moved out of the house and in this new starting era, and actually started to upscale. So the first floor in this new building that they purchased was used as the main factory, with Arturo Fuente and his wife Cristina living on the second floor. And Carlos Sr., he spent so much time at this factory. He worked there all day and all night, often past midnight, to try to keep up with all the things that he needed to do. Because not only did he want to oversee the production, but he kept the books by himself because he couldn't afford to pay anyone else to do so at the time. And he often even slept in the factory, which obviously jaded his family relationship a bit. I mean, his wife Anna once spent 3 weeks without being able to see her husband whatsoever, and actually threatened to leave him if he wouldn't come home. But in Carlos Sr.'s mind, leaving the factory wasn't any option really, since he was so focused on getting the company running and being the meticulous man that he was. He pleaded for his wife to move into the factory alongside him, which she finally accepted. The struggles resulted in some success as the production grew, and the staff soon had doubled to 100 employees. So you can say absolutely that time that he put in there was worth it. But he wanted more, however, much more. He had this vision, really, but he felt that cigar smokers in this era were too brand loyal. So really, it was the next big thing was very difficult to establish, since people were smoking the cigars that they were used to getting. And something needed to change.
This was the scene of turmoil in the capital, Havana, as the climax of revolution was reached. Anyone suspected of sympathy for the Batista regime came in for a rough time.
Yeah, and change things. Things certainly did, because what happened in 1959? Maybe people don't react to the date right away, but it's actually one of the biggest events in that decade worldwide, but probably one of the biggest events in the cigars history. The Cuban Revolution, of course, happened in 1959. We're not going to dive too deep into the Cuban Revolution itself here, as most listeners probably already know a bit about it, but it did mean change in massive ways. Everything was, made property of the government, completely turned into a communist nation, all that stuff. Obviously, the change meant bad things to many people in Cuba. A lot of people had to flee in Cuba. They had to flee the communist regime. But in a sort of twisted way, for the Fuente family, the revolution actually turned out to be exactly what the company needed. Like Ruben said, there was so much stagnation in the market. People were just smoking what they were used to at the time. They needed something to change majorly, and it couldn't come at a better time. So it was first, though, in 1962 that the effects of the Cuban Revolution really would run their course. Because at this time, it's been 3 years and not much has really happened. But as you guys obviously know, the U.S. placed their trade embargo signed by John F. Kennedy famously, and all U.S. and Cuban trade was cut. And like we've mentioned several times, they've been making cigars with Cuban tobacco. Pretty much every company in the U.S. has been doing this. So Carlos Sr. was actually lucky enough to be in Cuba right at the time that those events would take place. He was still traveling regularly to Cuba to buy tobacco, to seek out tobacco for the company, and he happened to be there right at the time around when they would sign the embargo. And he actually heard rumors that it was going to happen. Here, he actually did something he hadn't done a lot before. He made an executive decision, so to speak, so he didn't consult Arturo. Obviously, he couldn't just text him on his phone at this time, but he decided, he needed to act quickly. So he rushed around the island and bought as many bales of tobacco that he possibly could find. And they were priced at about $250 per bale. So he just went around, and as much money as he had, as much tobacco he could find, he was like, we need to, basically make sure that we have as much tobacco as we can get if the rumors are true. So he was actually able to procure a 3-year supply right before the embargo was signed, which, that's a godsend. That's an incredible stroke of luck or genius, whatever you want to call it. This was another crucial moment in the company's history, as the Arturo Fuente cigar factory was able to avoid the fate of many other cigar factories. I mean, at the time, like I mentioned, pretty much every producer in the U.S. was using Cuban tobacco. And, overnight, that was not an option anymore. And many factories didn't, they were smaller scale. They didn't have enough, stocks of tobacco themselves. They would order tobacco as they needed it, roll the cigars, sell the cigars, and order tobacco on the go. So as a lot of factories didn't have enough stock, they were forced to shut down immediately. I mean, what else can you do? Luckily enough, while the entire cigar industry was scrambling to find alternative tobacco producing nations, Arturo Fuente was able to continue through the 3-year supply they had. And that really bought them some time. They didn't need to stress. They had 3 years. They knew that. And, that really gave them room to breathe. They were actually even offered up to 10 times the price per bale that Carlos Sr. had originally paid. So, he was offered thousands of dollars per bale, but he actually refused. He realized, sure, they could get some cash in hand quickly, but for the security of the company, they really needed to keep the tobacco. So, let's move on here, lad. What else are the effects? I mean, obviously they do have their tobacco, but there's some more effects of the Cuban Revolution here.
Yes, of course. This takes us back to the absolute paradigm shift that the Cuban Revolution really was, because as mentioned, other cigar producing terroirs needed to be found other than Cuba, since that wasn't an option anymore. So Carlos Sr. felt that this really removed that brand loyalty that we talked about earlier, that everyone was just buying the same thing, and which was really keeping his company's growth so stagnant. So everyone was suddenly on a level playing field, as all the established cigars and their flavors were gone from the market. So Arturo and Carlos Fuente began experimenting with a vast variety of tobacco from several different countries. They bought tobacco from countries such as Puerto Rico and Colombia and blended meticulously to try to replicate a similar type of smoking experience as the Havana cigars they had been making for decades. So they finally reached their goal and released the Flor de Orlando cigar line. It's kind of funny actually looking back at the packaging of this Flor de Orlando, because it's so incredibly clear how the deep roots of Cuban tobacco were in the United States at the time. yeah, we can't show a picture here, but after over 100 years of smoking Cuban cigars, it must have been such a shock to have to go something completely different. Because on that box, it actually reads made under direct Cuban supervision using vintage Havana seeds. So it doesn't state now that it's a non-Cuban cigar, really. So nothing regarding the actual countries of the origin appeared as traditional. Just the box appeared as traditionally Cuban as possible. But funnily enough, Fuente never actually advertised the fact that their cigars stopped containing Cuban tobacco. They just continued using Cuban tobacco for the years after the embargo due to his extremely smart move of stockpiling which they had done. But when they ran out, they never actually said so. So Carlos Sr. didn't want to make the mistake that other factories had made, which had sent them to an early grave, really.
Yeah, this is kind of a funny fact, just to say it quickly, because I mean, apparently a lot of other companies were straightforward into saying that they stopped using Cuban tobacco, but that killed them. Like, successful companies were able to get good quality Cuban tobacco, but at the same time, people were like, well, I can still get my Cuban cigars from Fuente, and I mean, I'm sure other companies still have tobacco, so Fuente would just keep going, and they'd say, no, we still have Cuban tobacco, and they just never said it. But that's also another interesting thought, because they had to have stopped at some point, right? As we heard. I wonder how big of a difference there was. I mean, they really must have done well to replicate the flavor, because I mean, all of a sudden the cigars just stopped having Cuban tobacco. So that's pretty
exactly. It should be said though that Fuente he didn't if he was asked, he would say that it's not Cuban, but he didn't advertise it.
Yeah, that's very true.
Like it was also a if no one asks, he didn't say it really.
But we're actually we're in 1965 now, so we're exactly at 3 years after the embargo. They're out of Cuban tobacco now. Cuba's behind us, and the company has finally grown enough from all those savvy decisions made by Carlos Sr. that they were able to purchase the Charles the Great building in Ybor City on 22nd Street. And that might not scream like a famous building to you guys listening, but this is a very big deal. Very, very big deal. Even a bigger deal than their first factory that they were able to buy. Because this tall and grand brick building for the first time, so less of a fire hazard, was built in 1895, and this was a long shot away from, as I mentioned, the much more brittle and small wood buildings that the company had relied on for all the decades in the past. This was a real point of pride for the family. Carlos Sr. had actually been dreaming of making cigars in this building in the years prior, when he was working around the clock in their 2-story corner building in the same city. He even actually used to tell his father that one day they would own that building, and this is a dream he could finally realize. So that's a monumental part, that he could finally make cigars there. That was probably felt like such a long shot years before, and now, just in a few years they've gone from the house to a small factory to a big one. So it really shows how much impact Carlos Sr.'s made in just a few years since taking over the company. It's quite astounding. Again, the company would continue to grow. We're now into the 1970s. Not a lot has been happening. I mean, again, you have to realize that they're just starting out blending non-Cuban cigars, so they're really trying to establish themselves. There's probably kind of a lot of chaos on the market. And now we're finally into the 1970s. And things have been sounding like they've been going very well. There's been a lot of fortune, but this is really a tough decade for the family, a very tough decade. In 1973, Arturo Fuente, the namesake, the guy that created everything, he sadly passed away, though at the age of 85, so he had a long and prosperous life. But of course, this devastated the family. And beyond that, beyond the magnificent life of Arturo Fuente that finally came to an end, the business was also starting to come to a tough place. The U.S. had been such a flourishing country for manufacturing in general. Just all types of manufacturing was very common in the States. And manual labor was, often things were made in the U.S., but really in the 70s, things began to shift a lot. Inflation was rising a lot. I remember hearing something about rates. It was hard to get loans and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was just much tougher to make anything in the States anymore. But really, it was the rising labor costs that brought the biggest change for the cigar business. It was really tough to continue hand making cigars. I mean, it's kind of crazy thinking about that. The labor costs we have now in the States, the fact that they had such a big business in the States until the 70s, but finally it's become very tough to make the cigars there without the prices completely skyrocketing, and that's a death sentence for any company. So a lot of companies actually turned to machine making, and this is really the era where even in Cuba they were machine making stuff. This is the era where that really took off, and made cigars were becoming a lot more popular. Big part due to the rising labor costs. And this, of course, included Arturo Fuente, who made machine-rolled cigars under the name Moya and Trinidad. So they had two brand names of their machine-made cigars, so they made new brands for that. And they still kept their classic Arturo Fuente brand itself, completely handmade. And that's really kind of a point to touch on that. Carlos Sr., he always wanted to make handmade cigars. He was very much a traditionalist in that sense. He felt that the classic cigars that he grew up with, that was the right way to do it. Of course, he would make machine-made cigars to survive, because if he wouldn't have pivoted in that way, I mean, they would have been gone. But he still wanted to remain with the handmade stuff. And they still sold some of the handmade cigars, of course. But at this point already, the vast majority of their sales actually came from the machine-made counterparts. So they've taken off that much. And to balance this, Carlos Sr. had to look outside of Ybor City for rollers to try to keep the handmade stuff going. So he tried making cigars by hand with rollers in Mexico. That failed. He moved to Puerto Rico. Not much success there either. So he's not really getting far at all. And this is kind of a tough situation here. He doesn't really know what to do. So it wasn't really until a trip to Nicaragua. Again, he's scrambling around. He's trying to see, where can I go? What can I do? Where can we find a viable spot? And this was made possible by Angel Oliva Jr. Oliva, of course, is probably a name that a lot of people in the cigar industry recognize. He came to Nicaragua. He sampled some cigars at a factory, and he was so impressed that he bought the entire stock. He invested in the factory, and he's like, we got our spot. Nicaragua it is. So finally some success. They started making cigars in Nicaragua. Obviously, prices to roll cigars there are much lower than the States, so they can do it there. And the business started taking off immensely with these Nicaraguan hand-rolled cigars. It went really quickly, and they employed 300 people there in that factory, which is huge. And in their heyday, they produced up to 18,000 cigars each and every day there. But as we know with the Fuentes, success isn't sustained for that long without some troubles, right, lad?
9 months after losing a brief civil war that cost thousands of lives, the Sandinist guerrillas have launched what they call their final offensive. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, is named after the 1920s nationalist leader Augusto Sandino. At the beginning of June, they began their fight on 3 major fronts: along the Atlantic coast, in the north around Leon, and on the southern border with Costa Rica.
Yes, unfortunately, that has been the story of the Fuentes, that when they've finally gone going again, something has torn them down. And at this time, in the late 70s in Nicaragua, it was very much not a stable time, because there was a dictatorship run by the Somoza family that had governed Nicaragua since 1936, and things were finally reaching the tipping point here. So without going into too much detail, the Somoza family, like most authoritarian dictatorships, were not kind people. They controlled a military group called the National Guard, who tortured and murdered anyone in their way. So by the end of the 70s, Nicaragua had turned into a full-on civil war, with the Somozas on one side and the Sandinista National Liberty Front on the other. The latter group started to turn the tide and take control. So yeah, as we said, history has a way of repeating itself, and due to the revolution and in a very twisted and dark turn of events, the Fuente factory in Nicaragua actually burnt down again, just as Arturo Fuente's original factory had done over half a century before. So Carlos Sr., now in the running spot, he's running this company, was to face the similar struggles as his father had just done the same way, but without his guidance by his side now. He did, however, have that fighting spirit that was instilled in him, and of course refused to give up. And this is a theme that we really keep getting back to, is this fighting Fuente spirit.
Definitely. They quickly bounced back, and they moved to Honduras. They scrambled. I mean, the story is actually crazy. Carlos Sr. had to flee Nicaragua in the last minute he got out, and they had to bounce back. And they set up a factory in Honduras, and they started production immediately, and it went well. But within a year, they got a phone call, lad. And do you want to guess what happened to the factory in Honduras?
I wouldn't dare.
Yeah, well, we have the fighting spirit. That's a theme. We have the passion for cigars. That's a theme, and the fires are a very central theme here. Because would you believe it? There's an accidental fire in Honduras, and everything burns down again. So 2 factories within a year have burned down. So now they've been, in a couple of years, they've gone to Nicaragua. It's burned down. They've gone to Honduras, and it's burned down. And I mean, at this point, they're devastated. They have basically nothing. So a lot. They have 3 viable options here, really. What can they do here? I mean, what can they do here, lad?
Yep. So the 3 options they had were to either they just sell their entire business and count their losses, of course, not an option for families such as the Fuentes. The second option being to leave the entire business of handmade cigars behind and only focus on the machine rolling that they had in the US to try to bounce back. Or the third option, to keep fighting for what they believe to be the best type of cigars and move the handmade production to a different country. And I guess, knowing the Fuentes at this point, you can understand which option they went for. They obviously went for the third option, but the most difficult option. But obviously was the only option available or viable for a fighter like Carlos Sr., and moved to the Dominican Republic. So Carlos Sr. realized he couldn't do this all alone, and luckily enough, he wasn't alone, right?
No, well, he actually had his son, so this is a perfect time to introduce little Carlito Fuente. And we need to jump back in time a little bit again, as we're hopping back and forth, but we're finally introducing the 3rd generation of Fuentes here. So in 1954, the 3rd tobacco generation in the Fuente family is born, as Carlos Sr.'s wife gives birth to a son called Carlos Jr., again, now you see the confusion of why we decided to name Carlos Sr., because he's another Carlos. But this Carlos is actually most known as Carlito, so we're going to call him that throughout the rest of the story. So you have Arturo Fuente, who began the company. Then you have Carlos Sr., who take over. And then now you have his son, Carlito Fuente. So the story goes that young Carlito had tobacco in his blood from day one, quite literally. He once got so sick as a child that his mother was forced to take him to the doctor. The doctor found out that he had so much nicotine in his system from running around the factory that he'd gone sick, nicotine poisoning. This, of course, was during the time when they were still making the cigars in his house, so there's, you can't really get away from the tobacco, but he was running around the house and it's all just filled with cigars. Maybe not the most healthy start to life, but tobacco was in his blood nonetheless. In this very factory, quote unquote, so to say, 3 generations were now living together, as his parents were still young and financially unable to live anywhere else. So we're just touching base with the prior part of the story here. Carlito smoked his first ever cigar already at the age of 6, actually. The curiosity to in some way understand the family business and get his first taste of it was just a little bit too much for little Carlito to resist. He thinks back to the moments he would spend on the porch with the entire family and the wonderful neighbors of the community that would come by the house and smoke a cigar, share a cigar with his grandfather Arturo. And it's not really that difficult to understand why family matters so much to Carlito today and why he holds traditions and family history so alive. So, back to the move to the DR, lad.
Yes, and they moved to the Dominican Republic, In January of 1980, Carlos Sr. met with the Oliva family once again to discuss a venture to the Dominican Republic. And this may sound like a no-brainer today, right? I mean, Santiago, the second largest city in the Dominican Republic, is one of the cigar capitals of the world. Huge brands like Davidoff have their factories there, and well, the region creates an immense amount of cigars today. 40 years ago, though, this was not really the case at all. Well, starting off, Carlos Sr. considered himself broke at the time, and to make this move even remotely possible in the first place, he had to mortgage off his house. The family had to put in all the cash they had and leave the safety and comfort of their life in the U.S. for a completely new place. He even asked, I said he had to mortgage his house off, and he even took help from Carlito and asked him how much money he had, and that was a couple of thousands of dollars. And he said, well, yeah, that's going to be enough. We're going to make this move. And Carlito, he remembers the Dominican Republic at this time as, well, a place where, to put it in what he said, the bread was like rocks and the toilet paper was like sandpaper. So it lacked all the modern amenities. And when the family traveled there, they needed to bring basic goods like diapers and sugar. So they didn't really have their own phone either, but instead the whole neighborhood had to share one single phone to use collectively. So you can really put your mind to what kind of place they had moved to from the US coming now to the Dominican Republic to continue their dream. The Fuentes, who had obviously gone all in on the Dominican Republic at this point, weren't only inconvenienced by the lack of comfort. They actually had genuine fears that the lack of stability in the country would lead to the same fate as in Nicaragua. And at one point even, they thought a revolution was entirely possible, which must have put a lot of fear into them, since they had just put everything at risk to move to the Dominican Republic, leaving safe home to come here. But luckily, stability returned enough so that the Fuentes could establish themselves fully in the country and truly blossom.
Again, though, the Fuentes continued to work in the Dominican Republic as much as they'd done originally in Ybor City. As you probably have noticed from now, these aren't lazy people that give up easy. So, Carlito Fuente himself recalls the struggle and hard work they all had to put in. They were working up to 18 hours a day non-stop just to grow the company back to where it was. I mean, you really have to put yourself in their shoes. Not only, from the stuff that Ruben talked about, how tough it was in the primitive version of the DR at the time, but they just had 2 factories burned down, and still they have this, ability to just continue as if nothing had happened, and there was no other option. Carlos Sr. put every penny of profit that they got back into the company and invested everything in tobacco. Here he kind of came to the conclusion at this point that aged tobacco was worth its weight in gold, obviously figuratively speaking, and not exactly literally. But he invested much more and more in aged tobacco, and he really aimed to keep a good stock. And he noticed much better results came from the more aged tobacco he used. Customers liked it more, sales increased, ratings increased, all that stuff. This practice obviously remains today, and anyone who's seen the immense vaults of aged and aging tobacco that the Fuentes have access to today will definitely recognize this. It's not something that they take lightly. The Fuentes, they began buying good tobacco regardless of the situation at the time, regardless of the space they had for it or not. So even if they didn't have any space, they had to buy it. Like Carlos Sr. said, good tobacco is good tobacco, and you'll always need it. And I'm sure this really originally stems from the time where Carlos Sr. himself bought all those bales of tobacco in Cuba, even though they didn't need it at the time, and it didn't seem completely financially responsible, but it paid off massively. So he really had that idea that, you can never go wrong with having more tobacco, and I'm sure as cigar smokers, that's something we can relate to a bit as well. In 1981, so we're just a year after moving to their DR 12,000 square foot factory, they started with the Hemingway series, and this is the first cigar of the story, really. I mean, we've talked for a long time, and this is the first cigar that we still recognize today, and you can still go and buy it. And to go on a tiny little sidebar here, again, the cigar industry had really rapidly changed throughout the 1900s. I mean, we go from the Cuban cigars in the beginning to the handmade stuff, going towards automation, And another effect of the rapidly changing market was that if you guys think back, in the early 1900s, the perfecto shape was by far the most prominent shape in the industry. I mean, if you look at old posters, you look at old cartoons, all that stuff from that era, the perfecto cigars with the two tapered ends is always the stereotypical style cigar. But with the dawn of the machine-making cigars, and a lot of the original cigar makers in the US and all that stuff, they've died off. So parejo cigars, the classic straight cigars, were much easier to roll with machines, much easier to roll with learning rollers. So the highly artisanal perfecto shape, which is a really difficult shape, I mean, it is really generally known as the toughest cigar shape to roll by hand. It was quickly forgotten. So in the late 1980s, when the Fuentes began their production in the DR, not in the late 1980s, in the early 1980s when they began their production in the DR, producing these perfecto-shaped cigars was really considered a lost art since those earlier Cuban times. In fact, apart from just a few torpedoes, there were basically no shaped or figurado cigars on the market whatsoever, which is crazy to think now. Carlito Fuente actually found some very old molds with a perfecto shape, and he began blending that medium-bodied series that became the Hemingway series. And he both wanted that old classic look, but he also found this a way to kind of differentiate himself on the market because it was so unusual, right? And that short story that he blended at the time, that's still a very popular cigar on today's market. That Hemingway short story, it's still legendary today, but back then it became an instant hit, immediately one of their best-selling cigars. And at the time, the Cigar Connoisseur magazine, that's not one we recognize today, but these are the days before Cigar Aficionado, that magazine actually wrote about the Hemingway series in 1984, and this kind of put them more on a global map because they hadn't really been that big before. So yeah, lad, they've got some stuff to move on from.
Exactly, and as you touched on lightly there, Carlito Fuente, he loved all the history of cigars and had learned so much from his late grandfather Arturo Fuente, and then obviously his father Carlos Sr. after him. So thus, he despised the dead cigar market of the 70s and 80s that consisted of pretty much all the same cigars, leading to the radical shape of the Hemingway series. But he also found the packaging to be very monotone and dull. So what he really saw here was that all the bands were of just two colors and the packaging was very plain. Carlito said, and I quote, "I want to bring back the old things, not only the shapes and the romance, the things that were not popular anymore, but also the art and the history." So for Carlito, it wasn't only about making these great cigars, but he wanted to bring back this history and art that he had learned from his grandfather and father. So he created more colorful and artistic bands and boxes inspired from the heyday of cigars. And looking back at this cigar today, Carlito holds the Hemingway line very dear to his heart, since it did serve as this revolutionary cigar that paved the way for other brands to follow suit and bring back the art to this industry that had been lost for decades. So at this point in time, mid-80s, the Dominican Republic factories were flourishing, and the Fuente family all living there, making the Ybor City location less suitable for their operations, really. But with the immense history and emotion tied to Ybor City, they've had their entire life there, 3 generations. The factory was kept open, but solely as a distribution facility, which ended the era of handmade Fuente cigars in Tampa. However, Carlos Sr. didn't want to abandon this Tampa-made brand, Moya, which we mentioned earlier. So what he did was he partnered up with the Newman family and formed the affiliate known as Fanco, the Fuente and Newman cigar company, which turned out to be a very good partnership actually for both parts, with Newman making cigars in Tampa for Fuente and the Fuente returning hand-rolled cigars for Newman, which they produced in the Dominican Republic for Newman's American market, since it was very difficult to get these hand-rolled cigars in the U.S. Newman wanted, or to make them in the U.S., because of the high labor costs. Newman wanted a hand-rolled cigar that they could sell there. And so yeah, this partnership was born, really.
Perfect. Yeah, so things were going well for the Fuentes in the DR. They'd settled in very nicely. Their business was establishing itself. They were becoming a little more worldwide, and their cigars were much more loved than before. They'd been there for quite a while now, without anything burning down or anything. So, what does the Fuente family do in a situation like this? Everything is going well. Do they get complacent? Of course not. Quite the opposite in this story. An unnamed tobacconist from Paris, France, apparently this famous worldwide tobacconist, was visiting the Fuente production in the DR, and this was in 1988. And or 86, I believe, 86 or 88, he was visiting there. And he made a snide remark. He actually said, in quotes here, "You don't produce a cigar, you assemble a cigar." And that might not sound that crazy from the outside, but this shook Carlito Fuente to the core. And what he means here really is, the comment is on the fact that the Fuentes, they were still, you have to remember, they were just importing tobacco at this time. So they were importing a bunch of tobacco from different countries. That's what they'd done all the time, right? Way back in the day, they'd imported Cuban tobacco to the US. And they've been doing this every time they've moved to different places. So they were only really a factory. So they were importing tobacco, and then, like he said, they weren't producing the cigar, they were assembling the cigar. So they were just rolling it. And that really, that shook him to his core, Carlito Fuente. So this tobacconist, he held that old opinion that a puro, a classic cigar where all the tobacco is grown from the same terroir and country, was really superior, especially if it's made by the producer itself. And although the Fuentes didn't share, that opinion completely, this did give Carlito Fuente an itch that he just had to scratch. So for a very long time before this, just to give some background, the opinion of the Dominican Republic was that it was almost perfect for cigar tobacco production. But that almost is really important, because the terroir was long deemed unsuitable for growing high-quality wrapper tobacco, and this might be something that people have heard before. Sure, budget sticks were made at the time. They were used, and they used some shabby-looking wrapper leaves. You could grow tobacco wrappers in the DR, but nothing truly premium had ever come out of the DR as a true puro. It was often said that the soil in Cuba was blessed in a way that the soil in the DR wasn't. And Carlitos Fuentes' reaction to this was that, well, soil doesn't grow tobacco, human beings grow tobacco. So now that they have sufficient resources to expand and experiment, and fueled by that, itch that he wanted to disprove the impossible, Carlitos set out on a quest. He would not rest until he could prove everyone wrong and make a world-class Dominican puro. Right, lad?
So yeah, other companies had tried for years to make a Dominican puro, but reportedly lost millions in the process. But obviously the recurring theme here that we keep coming back to is that the Fuentes are fighters and never quitters. So it was a slow process for the first few years, and the first harvests were complete failures. But like his father and grandfather before him, Carlito wouldn't give up. And the facilities here weren't up to scratch for this project either. They had been growing, they had been mostly a factory before and less of a farm before the end of the 80s. So this remark that they were only assemblers of cigars inspired the family to expand their production of tobacco as a whole as well. So Carlito once tried to get out to the fields with his father in a truck one rainy day. They had to drive through the mud, and the truck got so stuck that they needed a John Deere to pull it out. And Carlos Sr. told Carlito to build roads or he wouldn't come back at all. As he said, he was a cigar maker and not a farmer. So build roads he did to satisfy his father, and curing barns and gazebos and all kinds of buildings and amenities to make what today is called Chateau de la Fuente, a cigar wonder.
Yeah, so back to this quote, unquote, impossible Dominican puro that really fueled this expansion. It had been kept behind closed doors for the years it took to really get the project going. Like Ruben mentioned, it was a slow burn. The first few harvests were a fail. But in 1992, they finally felt they'd overcome the challenges of growing that wrapper enough. They could finally reveal the project to the world. Originally, as kind of a joke, it was called the Project X from Planet 9. I don't really know where the where that comes from, but that's what they called it as a goof. Then in 1992, like I said, they finally revealed the project. But 1992 was actually a very significant year in another way for the cigar industry, because Cigar Aficionado was actually born that year. And that was actually a huge part in creating that legendary and absolutely massive cigar boom of the 1990s. So that is actually perfect timing for the Fuentes. They're making this crazy cigar, this huge project, and right at the time. But I mean, it is really important to highlight how insane the 1990s were. The cigar boom was unlike anything we've ever seen before. So in November 1995, now bearing the name Fuente Opus X that we all know today, the cigars were finally actually released. And they were only released to the eastern part of the United States. And, you know, in many ways, this actually goes back to the roots of the company, because that's actually the part of the country where Carlos Sr. first expanded outside of Tampa. Remember, he went to Miami and Manhattan and the eastern part of the U.S. The cigar, it sold out immediately. It was only limited to a couple per customer. And this is the first time the cigars hit the market. So that's actually a huge feat that it's sold out immediately. And you know, this incredibly is actually continued until today, and that's pretty cool to think of, that Opus X is still famously impossible to get a hold of, and it's still often limited to just a few per customer when the shops finally get some. And then connecting with this whole Opus story here is another interesting tidbit from this era is that in 1996, a winery called the Opus One Winery, which was a venture between Robert Mondavi Corporation and Baron Philippe de Rothschild S.A., for all you wine nerds out there might say something. They sued Fuente for using the word opus in their cigars. So it actually took 2 years, and it cost them millions of dollars. Both sides cost millions of dollars. But Fuente actually finally won in July of 1998, and this is something they bring up a lot. They really were full of pride of this, because they liken this as sort of David and Goliath style victory. But we've mentioned this several times now, lad. Let's go back to it here for you. The 90s was a crazy time, and it was a huge, huge cigar boom, right?
Yes, absolutely. You didn't undersell that at all. The 90s, we know, was, like you said, the crazy cigar boom. So even extremely unsuccessful brands that had struggled to barely sell anything before could all of a sudden not even meet demand. That is how crazy this demand really went. And since cigar tobacco takes years from planting it until it was ready, there simply wasn't enough tobacco available immediately to meet the demand. So due to this, the Fuentes, unfortunately, became a target in the industry. Companies rushed to the Dominican Republic and bought up a lot of stock, which hurt the established cigar makers, like the Fuentes. They also went after the rollers, another commodity that takes years to get ready through training. So what they did was they offered Fuentes rollers, masters of the art at this point, making the beautiful Hemingway Perfectos. They offered them tons of money to switch allegiances. And Fuente lost over 500 rollers in a year during this crazy 90s. So that obviously is something that's going to affect the business. And Carlito Fuente, he had to create a completely new rollers program called Operation Blank Slate, which would protect them from this poaching. Another innovative idea by the Fuente family here to secure the company in this market. So the Fuentes sought out workers who hadn't made cigars before, interestingly enough. So they were trained to make cigars much slower and carefully in a style known as entubado, in which the roller creates a tube with each leaf. So this is slower than the standard Dominican methods of cigar production, where tobacco leaves are made into S shapes, giving the bunch a look similar to an accordion. And Fuente wanted the rollers to make beautiful cigars, but to make them slowly. And this was because since they had this poaching, if anyone tried to steal them away again, they wouldn't be able to work in the faster style high tempo factories that just really wanted to sell as much as possible and not focus on the quality as much.
We lost everything after the embargo. We lost everything to fires. We lost things in the revolution, and we lost it everything. So, but you know what? We haven't lost our integrity. When we were challenged, we felt our principles and our integrities were challenged. It didn't matter whether we won or lost. What really mattered is that how we walked out of it with our heads up.
I couldn't accept it. There's no way I would accept it. And I told my son, even though if we lose everything, it's whatever it takes. I mean, I remember I was born without nothing. I start again without nothing. And I never got scared about that.
Yeah, spot on. What a crazy era. Insane that they
not
were
only
approached.
stealing commodities, but stealing, people.
Yeah, it's nuts to think back to the 90s there. But continuing on in the 90s, obviously they were now fighting with a lot more brands. There were so many brands around, and the Fuentes, they were still doing their philosophy though, slow and careful, quality over quantity. And in January 1996, it started to pay off. A tasting in Cigar Insider, another magazine we still have today, they gave Fuente 4 prestigious scores in the 90s, so obviously very good. That included one score of 94 points for the Perfección number 2, which is one of those opuses, which was a pyramid. And these successes, the scoring, obviously, I mean, that always helps a company, along with the fact that the 90s was such an incredible time for cigars in terms of demand, really meant that the company absolutely expanded. I mean, obviously, there were tough parts, the poaching and all that stuff, but it really still exploded. So in 1997, this was really when the cigar boom peaked here, because Fuente produced a whopping 40 million cigars in that year, which is a huge leap from the thousands they made just a few decades prior. I mean, can you think back to when they made like 1,000 cigars a year in the house, and then just a couple decades later, 40 million. Yeah, but now, lad, we reach one of these moments yet again, where the Fuente family are on top of the world and everything seems perfect. They're producing more cigars than ever. They're getting higher ratings than ever. So, what happens on the 15th of September, 1998?
It's a name we won't soon forget. Hurricane George. His threats of intense winds and driving rain forced over 1 million of us to seek higher ground. One of the biggest evacuations ever to take place. And as many of us come home feeling somewhat fortunate, let's never forget the power of nature.
Yeah, this is an extremely sad time as well, because the powerful and long-lived Category 4 hurricane called George's rages through the Caribbean. It was extremely costly and fatal, killing 604 total people. Worst of all, though, was the island of Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic is located. So 380 of the fatalities were actually in the Dominican Republic alone, and of course this would hurt the Fuente family greatly. It may sound minor in the grand scheme of things now, as they didn't lose any lives, thank God, but 17 of their 19 curing barns were torn apart, and they lost huge amounts of tobacco at the chateau. And at the Chateau de la Fuente, there stands 8 majestic palm trees. Not only are they beautiful visually, but even more so symbolically, because in the ramifications of Hurricane George, over 200 palm trees were wiped out, only for these 8 to remain standing, firmly and unwavering, much like the Fuente family did then, and like they have whenever faced with setbacks throughout history. So these surviving palm trees stood in the middle of the newly sowed tobacco fields, but Carlito refused to cut them down as a symbol for the history of the Fuente family that have had to face many knockdowns and pick themselves up after every single one to get where they are today. And in a time like the 90s, where the global cigar supply already couldn't keep up with the demand, this was devastating. Obviously, especially for their widely successful Opus line that had to be put on hold as they had to rebuild. So again, the Fuentes stayed strong and built again, and something positive came from it. As they didn't have enough wrapper to make more Opus X cigars, they used the binders and fillers and wrapped it in a new Connecticut broadleaf, which led to the new line, the Añejo, a lovely line of cigars that we sampled pretty recently, actually, right, Lon?
Yeah, lovely cigars. with that darker broadleaf. So something nice came out of the dark moments. And like Ruben said, they rebuilt. And as always, they're faced with adversity, but their success continues as they fight through that adversity. Carlito Fuente, through his Opus line, he really showcased a new taste of powerful and full-bodied cigars. You have to also remember at this time, before the cigar boom of the 90s, the popular cigars at the time, they were really light. It's the kind of Macanudo Connecticut style cigar that was dominating the market before. So the Opus was kind of groundbreaking, not only in the fact that he created a Dominican Puro that was a success, but it was actually much heavier than a lot of other cigars on the market, and that also kind of raised eyebrows, and that helped to develop a changing taste at the market at the time. And these heavier, more powerful cigars that Carlito Fuente personally really enjoyed were becoming much more popular. And Fuente continued along these lines, as in 1999, they created the heavy Ashton Virgin Sun-Grown, or the VSG as it's known. And that's a highly rated cigar, and still to this day, it's legendary. A lot of people listening here has probably tried that cigar. And Carlos Sr. at this time, he was given a lot of credit himself, but he's time and time again refuted that, and he's really been strongly wanting to give all the credit from all the blends in the last decades here to his son Carlito Fuente, because he's really who took over this aspect after the successes of Opus. Carlos Sr. has really, that's a point of pride for him that Carlito is such a master of blending, and he says that over and over again. Tons of lines come up here. The Don Carlos line, which Carlito actually blended in honor of his own father, Don Carlos himself, and that used their prized Cameroon wrappers as well. And other things like the Rosado Sun-Grown followed suit, and these are all smash hit cigars, and we still have them on the market today, and that kind of says a lot. So in 2001, we're already in the 2000s here, but it's just success after success after that horrific hurricane. We're finally at a point where they've really built something here. They feel like they're in the DR to stay at this point. They've settled down, and this is their place where they're going to be. And they feel like now they can start to give back to the community. So along with the Newmans, who they already had partnered with before, they created this new foundation called the Cigar Family Charitable Foundation. And this foundation would help the less fortunate in the DR. And this especially focused on that area of people that lived close to the Chateau de la Fuente. So that was a very underdeveloped part. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, in between Santiago and Santo Domingo. It's, kind of in the middle of nowhere. So they really helped put some infrastructure there. They built clean water stations in the area. They built a school, and then they even expanded that into a high school. So, they did massive things for the community. And their foundation has just continued to grow. It's now UN recognized, which is a point of pride for them as well. It still helps countless of lives to this day. And it's just something that we can really look up to. So, cigar-wise though, Lad, how are they doing?
Yeah, so obviously they've done great things for the community, but cigar-wise, the successes certainly continue to come. Mm-hmm. In 2005, the Fuente Opus X Double Corona was named Cigar Aficionado's Cigar of the Year.
Huge.
Which a huge feat. And in 2010, the XXX Bellicoso was the number 3 cigar of the year. So they were making 30 million cigars a year in 2010, which sounds like a step back from the 90s, but in actuality is a huge number in this day and age, because remember, we talked about that boom in the 90s, mm-hmm. and after that, the cigar demand has decreased a bit.
Yeah.
So 30 million a year, so much.
Yeah.
And obviously these accolades give the brand further boost as they continue to expand the lines they make. They add more Opus cigars too, and some of them have really, really cool stories. So if you want to kick them off here with one.
Yeah, for sure. So we mentioned the original Opus. That was obviously with the goal of the original Dominican Puro, but the Opus that's often regarded as the easiest to find is called the Lost City. Some of you guys may recognize that name. And this has a pretty funny story. As the famous Cuban-American actor Andy Garcia, he actually contacted Carlos Sr. in 2004. And they were filming his movie called The Lost City, and they needed filming locations. They wanted to film in tobacco fields. And what better place to film than at the Chateau de la Fuente? But maybe Andy Garcia wasn't a huge cigar savant at the time because he wanted to film in July of 2004. And for those that don't know, that's majorly the off-season, so-called, in the DR. So that all the crops had already been harvested. But the Fuentes still wanted to help out, very kind people. So to provide the backdrop that they needed for the movie, they planted 15 acres of tobacco during the so-called off-season. And originally, I think they just did this as a kind gesture. You know, it was a nice thing to do. But this tobacco didn't actually go to waste. They still harvested it and they used it. And finally, they released the Lost City Opus Edition, which was released in 2009. Became a huge success, still available to this day. I still believe they plant the tobacco in the off-season, and it's still done in the same way. And after that, we have the Angel's Share, and this cigar has an equally crazy, but probably a little sadder story. If you hadn't noticed already, and I'm sure we've said that many times here, but rebuilding is just such a massive theme in this Fuente story. And like I said earlier, fires are sadly that too. In 2011, near the company's main office in the city of Santiago, in a place called Villa González, a huge fire broke out again. Another fire. And this time, 2 large warehouses are the casualties here. And these 2 large warehouses burned down completely. And a massive inventory of tobacco with irreplaceable aged stock burned completely to the ground. And the Fuentes described this as the angels were smoking the tobacco that burned into the sky. And this was right before their 100-year centennial anniversary, so that's even more of a gut punch. But this inspired them to launch a new line of Opus. They were going to plan to launch a new line of cigars for the 100 years, but they lost a lot of that tobacco. So instead, they make a new Opus called the Opus X Angel's Share, obviously referring to the burnt tobacco. And a quote here from Carlos Sr. here, that we lost so much tobacco, he says. All the money in the world could not replace it. And you can't wait another 30, 40 years for that tobacco. The angels smoked it all. And it happened at the dawn of our 100th anniversary. But I said, this is not going to take me down. Things happen for a reason. And that's really highlights sort of his mentality. So... do they give up here, lad? Again, do they give up?
Of course not. Of course not. You know the Fuentes by now, and of course the Fuentes bounced back from this as well. And the Angel's Share was obviously an enormous success. I mean, what a story. Mm-hmm. And their success was so inspirational that Cigar Aficionado actually put Carlos Sr. and Carlita Fuente on the cover in 2012. And this was such a huge thing because this was the first time ever that a manufacturer was on the cover since the pages start 20 years ago, 24 years before that. And, all of this leads up to their big 100-year celebration, which happened in that classic Charles the Great factory in Ybor City. The factory Carlos Sr. always dreamed of owning. There, they celebrated the company and the lives of those that built it, especially Arturo Fuente himself. Carlos Sr. said during his speech, "We don't hurry things. We just do things the way they are supposed to be done." And I believe this quote really summarizes as well everything that the Fuente family has done, because when they had when they had the decision of either making only machine-made cigars and scrapping the hand-rolled, when that was the most difficult thing, that wasn't at all what they wanted to do. They prevailed, and they stuck to what they wanted, and they prevailed. So that is, some integrity right there.
Spot on. Yeah, they never rush the hands of times. And there, I think in a way, the story kind of reaches a natural ending. Of course, 2012 isn't modern day, but that sort of ties it together. Some things certainly have happened since then. Carlos Sr. tragically passed away in 2016. This time, he passed at the age of 81. Arturo Fuente, the original, passed at 85, many decades before. And he was involved in the company until his final days. Obviously, it was always family run. He famously did all the bookkeeping for the entire company up until 2005 even, with the help of his daughter. And this really highlights how much of a family operation this was. I mean, they were making tens of millions of cigars at that time, and he was still just running the books, which is immense. And now Carlito Fuente, the third generation, runs the company, and his son Carlos III and his daughter Liana Fuente are next in line. So there are still generations to come.
And their vision of expansion has also continued. So in 2018, they broke ground to make a new 69,000 square foot factory in the Santiago Free Zone, which will be able to take them even further. In the same year, Carlito proclaimed, "Carlito's back," referring to the Fuente family's return to Nicaragua for the first time since 1979. With a new factory called Gran Fábrica de Tabacas La Bella y La Bastia is being built there, which all lead to new exciting opportunities.
So there you have it. Strength, fighting spirit, and desire really highlight the themes of the story of the Fuente family. The Arturo Fuente company has been described in a good way, where they have the production of a huge company, but the mentality of a small boutique brand. I think that sums them up pretty well. They've always wanted to make the best cigars, not the most, quality over quantity, always with the family, and so it has been, and so it will continue to be. Because as we know, it takes a lot to knock down a Fuente.